What's up, everyone? Today I'm going to see what happens when I do kind of step 2 on this root over rock. I'm going to start exposing some of the roots. All right, well, if I remember correctly, I put this in here a year ago, but who knows? This is not that different than exposed root, but obviously there's a big rock here in the middle. And so I don't want to do anything to really, I don't want to remove all of the soil, especially before I know what's going on with the roots. And I've already looked underneath the bottom here to see if there are any roots poking out on the bottom, and there definitely are. And it grew really strong for the past growing season, so I know that's a good sign that there are some good roots. But if I expose them too quickly, it has the tendency to kind of kill off some of the smaller roots that might have otherwise made it, and then you end up with fewer large roots and maybe not enough roots to really grip the rock as well. But if I wait too long, then the roots might be too big. So I like to kind of open them up and check them and work with closing up any gaps that are between the roots and the rock by wrapping them. So let me take a look here. If you hadn't guessed, this is an upside down 1 gallon can, and then this was another 1 gallon can. And if you cut the bottoms off of 2 1 gallon cans and kind of stick the small ends together, they make a nice homemade tube that's really good for this kind of thing. And now I haven't taken the top one completely out. I just sort of cut it off where the bottom one ends, and I don't know, maybe I'll keep messing with it, maybe not. But I've let the soil that was loose just kind of fall away, and then I'm looking in here, because all of this soil is going to be gone in the final composition. I want to try to close up any gaps that exist between the rock and the roots. So for example, this root has like a little space in there, and so if I can take something and kind of push that root in up against the rock, that'll help the tree grip the rock more and make the composition a little bit more solid looking. And as these roots swell, they get more and more woody, so it becomes more difficult to do that. But at the same time, like these 2 big roots are really gripping the rock pretty well. Like they're right in contact with it along the pretty much, well, obviously not up here, but this one's in really good contact right here. This one's in really good contact right here too. So that's definitely a good sign that the tree is not going to come off the rock if I unwrap a little bit more. So maybe I'll see if I can cut off a couple more inches of pot here. And the good thing about using just old 1 gallon cans or, other stuff that you have laying around is that you're not really concerned about if you have to cut through it like this, which happens more frequently than not in this scenario, in my experience. All right, so in the first section that I removed, there weren't any feeder roots visible, and now I've gotten down to a few feeder roots, so I'm probably going to stop there, and that will keep any of these small to medium-sized roots that are still alive. This one's not, because there was nothing on the end of it. That'll keep them from dying off or dying back for the most part, and I can just sort of pack some of this soil back down in here. Now, any roots that are, you know, primarily, so like this is a good example. This obviously, if I don't cover it back up, is going to die. And so if I cared about having that branch root there, I would want to expose less root at once. But in this case, I'm not too concerned about that little root, and I actually think it's going to be better if I just try to manipulate this a little bit to get this portion to be in firm contact with the rock at this stage. I often use actually the 1/4-inch irrigation tubing or 1/8-inch irrigation tubing, depending on what I have handy when I'm out at the farm when I'm wrapping these things. But today I'm going to use raffia because that's what I have here in my workshop. And for the time being, I'm really just trying to make sure that these guys don't spread themselves out anymore. But these two roots right here need to get a little bit closer to the rock up in this section. So I'm going to use a technique to do that. But bottom line is, what I want to do here essentially is to take a piece of raffia or irrigation tubing or rope or whatever you have handy and tie it kind of firmly around the rock to give yourself sort of an anchor point. And I usually leave a pretty good tail here because I'm going to come back and tie more stuff to it in a few minutes. And then for the purposes of pushing these roots in, sometimes you can just use the raffia or other stuff, or you know, whatever you're wrapping the tree with, to push the roots up against the rock. But in this case, I think that's going to be hard because there's a little bit of a concave nature to this face of the rock. And so if I put a couple of chopsticks in here and then use the raffia to compress the chopsticks, I think that's going to do a better job of moving those roots tightly against the surface of the rock. And as with other operations with raffia, if you run out of length, you can basically tie together more pieces. And so I'm going to add another piece on the end of this, and then I'm going to start kind of pulling it. Now if I push these chopsticks in while pulling on the raffia, that should do the job of getting those roots to move towards the rock at least a little bit. And any amount that I do is going to help. Now this one up on the corner, I'm going to go under the chopstick because I want that to be held tightly against the rock. And apart from moving some of the roots, I'm also, now that the soil is gone from this scenario, I'm also trying to stabilize the roots that are here that maybe are attaching themselves relatively well to the rock, but could, you know, given enough jostling of the composition, work themselves apart over the course of the next year. So I'm going to continue just kind of wrapping this as tightly as possible, pushing the chopsticks in each time I go around, and then tie it off using the tail that I left when I originally tied this onto the rock. Now, if you let the slack go, like I just did by accident, you can kind of undo some of the progress you made, but you can always add an additional wrapping to it. All right, now on the opposite side, I want to kind of see if I can push these roots in here, and it is also concave. So I'm going to use this chopstick to kind of go over them, and then I'm going to apply pressure. So I've stuck that down into the raffia loops that I already put in there, and then I'm going to apply pressure to it as I kind of wrap it around, and hope that this can make a little bit of progress in terms of keeping them as close to the rock as possible as they continue to swell. So even if I'm not managing to compress them much, this will prevent those roots from being able to just move themselves away from the rock with the absence of the soil, and that can just hasten the process of making sure that the roots are well attached. And there comes a point where the roots kind of stop looking round. Essentially, they start conforming to the rock and start spreading sideways. That happens more with some species than with others. And on Japanese black pine, it's not particularly dramatic, but you can notice it if you look carefully. Now, these tie wires that were already attached to the basket, I'm just going to use these chopstick ends to just sort of stabilize it, just in case there's not enough roots going down into the pot yet. This will help stabilize it so that it doesn't damage any roots that are still transitioning from this down into the main container. So the only other thing that I want to do today to this tree is basically analyze, what are my potential fronts? And these things always change when you're still in the midst of a growing operation. But what are my potential fronts, and taking into account the most likely fronts, what should I do, if anything, to optimize the further growth of the tree? So the big question here, I think, is this portion all just sacrifice and then this is going to be the rest of the tree? Or is some portion of this going to be part of the finished composition? And that question is not easy to answer because we don't actually know. There's not a clear, in my mind, there's not like a really clear idea of how large this tree is going to be. So a little bit of movement put into here, and then this being a next section of trunk could make this a good medium-sized tree. Because of the rock and the roots that are going to be here, it's not going to be a small tree. It's going to be at least a medium-sized tree. But the question is it going to be a larger tree? And and the size of the stone is kind of like in the middle. If this ends up being a large tree, this stone is going to be probably more than half covered with roots, I'm guessing, which wouldn't be such a bad thing. And so the question is, in a large composition, this movement might kind of assume that the trunk swells to maybe at least half the width of this rock. And so it's got a long ways to go, but imagine it being more like a 2-inch, 2.5-inch wide trunk. Then this might be more relevant, and so maybe I could imagine using this as the next part of the composition. But once that happens, I won't have the ability to bend this, either moving it closer to the rock like that or further away from the rock. I already can't really bend it that much, so if I want more flexibility, I'm going to need to use this and just treat that as a sacrifice branch. So one thing's for sure, regardless of the size of the composition, I should add some movement to this before it gets too stiff. And that'll give me the option to use this as a trunk extension and then use that as the sacrifice branch. Barring that, I can also come back. I've got a nice healthy bud down here in these needles. So I could also cut this entire thing off and use just that if I want more taper as I move forward. It's kind of funny, it's hard to predict how these things are going to work, but if you imagine that this is just the first half of the tree and you lean this sort of over a little bit or something like that, and then you look at the movement of this section and maybe how this might, one of the buds up in here might then become the next trunk section, the movement of this starts to become a little bit more, interesting. The downside maybe is that the rock is actually wider from the other two sides where the movement all disappears. So it's a little bit difficult to pick a front right now, but I also can't remember, because I've done quite a few of these, I can't remember what the rock looks like down there, so it's a little bit premature. I think I'm going to leave this alone for today, and I've already removed a couple of branches from the whorl that's right here, and I'm just going to wire that. All right, so as I look at this, I'm kind of contemplating, it's going to give me more taper from the rock, which builds the taper in the lower portion of the composition, through here, which this sacrifice branch is going to help build up, and then this can be the next section. But if I want dramatic movement, like I was showing you with the rock tilted over this way, I can use this section and then cut the tree here and use that as the next section. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to give this a little bit more subtle movement. I'm not going to bring it down like it was a branch. What I'm going to do instead, now watch me like contradict myself. What I'm going to try first is to point this bud, which is going to create a much stronger extension than this part that's above it. This is actually a secondary growth from the summer. And then I'm going to bend this down. And that will give me another option in terms of trunk movement that might end up working out a little bit better. And since there's a bud here that would potentially create a branch there, let me bend this around to create a branch on a different side at the next junction. And so by doing that, I'm setting myself up with more options for the future that aren't just straight branches. And I think that this will give me more taper. If I elect to cut this off here, then the transition from the rock to the trunk to this section, the second section, might give me more taper in the composition in a more compact sort of space. And if I'm trying to make a small tree, that's a good thing. If I'm trying to make a big one, it's not necessarily as relevant. Now, this is something that I go through and do to a lot of trees in my growing operation. Each tree only takes a few minutes, as I've just, removed a little bit of this. I'm not doing a major transplanting. I wrapped it with some raffia. But this type of operation is really important. I'm checking to make sure that the roots look good, to make sure that as I continue exposing them, that there is not as big as surprises. I'm kind of wrapping them up here, making sure that they're well attached to the rock, and then wiring this to ensure that I have material to work with as this pine continues to grow through this early development stage. So don't skip these early development steps. You don't want to just wire this once and then set it out to grow for years and years and years. Neither do you want to come in and work on the same plant multiple times for no good reason. So try to sort of just determine, right now technically it's early winter. The solstice was yesterday, but I tend to work on these guys straight through winter because we have such mild winters here in California. But it's seasonal, so I wouldn't be doing this work necessarily at different times of year, although actually in this case I do expose roots straight through summer, as long as I'm not disturbing too much of the feeder roots, because I know that the tree is not actually relying on these big roots for water absorption. It's just for the actual transport and stability of the tree. All right, thanks everyone for watching. I hope you enjoyed that. If you have experience with root over rock that you want to share with everyone, put it in the comments below. We'll see you next time.